Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
This week in Toronto, Prime Minister Mark Carney huddled down with his inner circle for a strategy session. He and his ministers were trying to chart out a course for his government ahead of Parliament's return on September 15th. Carney, in launching the two-day event, notes they're trying to set priorities during some challenging economic times.
And so the focus of the government from the start has been on what we can control. Can't necessarily control the U.S. trade actions, global developments, technology, but we can control how we build this economy here at home.
The conversations between cabinet ministers and guests were largely focused on the economy and trade, with a big look ahead to the upcoming budget. But there was also an interesting talk about the shifting opinions of Canadians. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with CityNews reporter Glen McGregor, who's joining me by phone since he's out in the field at the hotel as this cabinet retreat wraps up. Glen, thanks very much for taking a few moments in between your hits for CityNews 24/7 to talk to us today.
My pleasure to be with you, Cormac.
Give us first, I guess, a basic rundown of what was being discussed at what they're calling a planning forum instead of a cabinet retreat, and then we'll get down to the more specifics on each issue.
Yeah, Mark Carney putting his own kind of branding on what has been sort of a traditional for Liberal governments, always getting together usually in September after the summer recess before MPs go back to work in Ottawa. This time, though, calling it a planning forum instead of an actual retreat, but really economic issues kind of front and center. This is all kind of happening in the context of this ongoing trade dispute with the United States, the tariffs, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of progress that Carney, despite calling Donald Trump even this week, and something that we learned at the first day of this cabinet forum, is that they had been in touch, and also that Carney's clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Sabia, is there in Washington trying to advance these negotiations. But this is kind of hanging over the whole thing. And it's, of course, this is a really crucial time because Mark Carney, after the election at the end of April, did not deliver a spring budget as is traditional. Usually, because the federal government's fiscal year starts April 1st, usually governments deliver a budget at the end of sometime in March, sometimes a little bit later into April, some even pushing it into May, but that just did not happen. At the time, the idea was that the future of the Canadian economy was too uncertain that the government really couldn't accurately project where its finances were going to be in a year, in 3 years, in 5 years. That does not seem to have changed now, but the government is proceeding with a federal budget that's going to come sometime this fall. We haven't learned yet exactly what day it was going to be. And that, of course, is all falling to François-Philippe Champagne, the finance minister. So he's spending a part of these 2 days here in North York, where the cabinet is meeting, kind of going around the cabinet table and making it clear to every other minister, look, at everyone is expected to deliver cuts, reducing your overall size of your departmental budget in order to meet this target that Carney has set of 15% reduction in government spending over the next 3 years. Now, of course, size of government really grew dramatically in the last few years. So this is the thing that Champagne has got to deal with. He's inheriting a much larger government, so he's going to have to make cuts. They're trying to do it as gently as possible without cutting services, direct services to Canadians, and potentially without cutting jobs, although there seems to be some conflicting information about that. It looks like the government is going to try as much as possible to reduce jobs through attrition. But this is the situation that Carney is in. It's a little bit like the situation that Jean Chrétien and his then finance minister, Paul Martin, found themselves kind of in the mid-1990s when they had to go in and make deep cuts. So the message here is, from this retreat, is that the government is proceeding with austerity measures that they say are going to be balanced with what they call investments, but are actually new spending, all designed to stimulate the economy, kind of reduce our dependence on the United States as an export market, and get going on some of those things that Carney promised during that election campaign, including championing big nation-building projects, pipelines, electricity interties, ports, LNG facilities, all those things they want to get going with, and they want to get shovels in the ground in 2 years. to try and accelerate the regulatory process to get those things going. But really, it is the potential of blowback towards what could be a very unpopular federal budget this government's going to table in a couple of weeks.
Was the minister asked about how he's able to square the investments with the cuts? Will the cuts in government be able to pay for the investments the government's hoping to make, especially at a time when they've gotten rid of things like the carbon tax and other sources of revenue?
Yeah, and the digital services tax was one of those things that Carney canceled almost immediately as soon as Donald Trump brought it up as an irritant to the trade relationship, hoping that if we scrap that, and that was supposed to be bringing in billions of dollars of extra revenue a year from the federal government from internet giants like Amazon and Netflix and Meta and Facebook. That's not happening now, so that revenue is gone. Keep in mind, the Carney government campaigned on reducing the tax rate for the lowest income people from 15% down to 14%, that lowest bracket. That's going to cost a lot of money too. The carbon tax also gone. So the question becomes, how do you offset that? At the same time, you're promising big spending, and the biggest spending ticket item so far that the Carney government has put a price tag on is increasing defense spending. Remember, the plan was for Canada to hit our NATO defense spending target, which equals 2% of our gross domestic product, basically 2% of the size of our economy. The original plan was for us to do that by 2032. That was even considered fairly aggressive. That was going to be a lot of increase in military spending. But Carney has said he's going to do it this current fiscal year. So this budget that Champagne is working on has got to account for an additional $9 billion in new spending. At the same time, we know the economy is slumping. GDP is going to drop largely because of the tariffs. That means less government revenues. And crucially, this is the thing that a lot of people always forget about the federal government's finances, is that we are still a petro state. We are really dependent on oil revenues and the taxes that those oil companies pay on their profits going to the federal government. So if the price of oil is down, as it has been on world markets now, that means the federal government collects less revenue. So you look at this, increased spending or investments, as Mark Carney likes to call them, at the same time, a drop in revenues. I don't see how they're going to square the circle. Maybe they have some information that we don't about what potentially, where that revenue could be made up. Certainly, Champagne was asked about this today. What are you going to do? How deep are you going to cut? Are there going to be actual job losses for public servants? He was, as he always is, elegantly evasive on those points, didn't really give us any figures. And in fairness to him, he doesn't have to until he tables that federal budget. It's going to lay all those things out. But it's starting to look like, given the fact we can't seem to solve this tariff and trade dispute with the Trump administration, and they're going to have to deliver a budget before we get any kind of resolution of that. And we just don't know what those numbers are going to be, how bad is it going to be, and then crucially, the figure that results from that is the plus minus, the takeaway of what the federal deficit is going to be. How much are we going to add to the national debt? Mark Carney is supposed to be an economic pragmatist, somebody who's supposed to really know markets and be able to deliver budgets that make sense. It's looking like a really challenging job for him in coming weeks.
We'll have more on the big story with CityNews political reporter Glen McGregor in just a moment. Okay, so let's expand a little bit on the U.S. trade talks, because we also got an update from the U.S.-Canada Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, about where things stand. You touched on it a little bit earlier. The clerk of the Privy Council down in the U.S., along with other Canadian officials, trying to make headway in Washington. But we learned a little bit more about where those discussions have gone from this point and what we're looking at further when it comes to a potential deal. What can you tell me about that?
Dominic LeBlanc, in his role as Canada-U.S. Trade Minister, has been doing a lot of shuttle diplomacy over recent weeks, going back and forth between Ottawa, most often meeting with Howard Lutnick, Trump's Commerce Secretary, who's kind of the point man on the tariff file. They have been in constant contact, all kind of trying to work towards this goal of either removing, at least the goal from a Canadian perspective, to either remove or reduce the tariffs on those key sectors. That is steel, the 50% tariff that's in on steel and aluminum right now. That's really damaging. Basically, at that level, Canadian steel mills can't can't realistically export much product to the United States. And then there's also the other sectors, the auto sector, softwood lumber, this long-standing trade irritant between our countries, still an issue. Copper exports as well. And Carney has raised the issue about pharma exports to the United States also being potentially hit by this. So we heard from LeBlanc earlier today talking about how he was down there meeting with Lutnick, the Canadian ambassador of the United States, Kirsten Hillman, who's playing an active role in this negotiations, also there. And yes, the clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Sabia, also there to provide, according to LeBlanc, to provide some technical information and maybe kind of explain some of the intricacies of the Canada-U.S. Mexico trade agreement, the CUSMA or USMCA, as they call it in the United States, that maybe Lutnick isn't fully up to speed on because it's a massive, complicated document that stands to be reviewed, potentially renegotiated, scheduled for that next year. That could all happen sooner. The new line we heard from LeBlanc today about these negotiations was the possibility of sort of smaller agreements. And not an overarching trade agreement, or not one big eureka moment where we set a tariff rate for all Canadian products and we agreed to abide by that in the same way that the Trump administration has done with the European Union, with the UK, with other G7 allies like Japan. But suggesting that there could be sort of sectoral agreements. Possibly there are kind of micro agreements, although we say micro, these are huge industries, of course, but smaller agreements that would exist either, outside or along with the CUSMA free trade agreement. But again, LeBlanc not giving a lot of details. We've not got a lot of oversight over these talks that have been going on now, really since Trump's inauguration back in January, that were supposed to kick into high gear after the G7 in June, when Trump and Carney both met on the sidelines of that summit. And the word from the Prime Minister's office shortly after was that July 23rd would be the key date that they were working towards. Then that got bumped a bit to that August 1st date, the same date that Trump was supposed to impose all the so-called Liberation Day tariffs on other countries. That date came and went. Trump increased the basic flat rate tariff on Canadian products from 25% to 35%, although the great majority of our exports that are affected by that are actually exempt under the trade agreement. So that wasn't a big deal, but there hasn't been much progress since then. We know these talks are going on. We get little smatterings. Occasionally, the Prime Minister's office will tell us that Mark Carney, and Donald Trump had a phone conversation, although the one that he revealed the other day, we didn't know about it until Wednesday morning, even though the conversation had occurred Monday night. So the talks are going on. We don't know if they're making any progress. It's looking more and more, Cormac, as if that we are not going to make any headway, and certainly not before Philippe Champagne has to stand up and deliver that budget in the House of Commons at some point.
Yeah, and I believe the line from the Prime Minister opening the Cabinet Planning Forum was that we shouldn't expect any white smoke anytime soon. So a reference, of course, to the papal conclaves. But Glenn, one other thing that I found really interesting is that we heard as well from pollsters in regards to Canadians' attitudes. I mean, since the election of President Donald Trump, he has been top of mind for most people in this country, especially after the trade war started. But there's a shift that's starting right now. What can you tell us about Canadians' attitudes towards Trump and other issues on the federal scale?
Yeah, Jean-Marc Léger is a very respected pollster, operates mostly in Quebec, but does poll nationally on these kinds of issues. And he was here yesterday to brief the cabinet on his findings about kind of not so much the typical polling about which party do you support, which leader do you prefer, but generally about their attitudes, what their concerns are. And yes, Trump and the tariffs have been kind of a top-of-line concern for quite a while. Remember, the election campaign was largely fought on this. Mark Carney won that campaign by promising to be the guy who was going to stand up to Donald Trump, the whole elbows up thing that really kind of inspired people. But Léger said that, yeah, you know what, the Trump and the tariffs are kind of dropping on the list, sort of the hierarchy of top priorities for most Canadians. Yes, they're still concerned about tariffs. I think he said that they rated them as that kind of that number 4 issue, but really their larger concerns were broader, concerns about the economy, the direction of the economy, and crucially, housing, cost of living, inflation, still issues. Those are issues that really dog former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the final months of his time in office. Carney was supposed to turn that around, really set the focus on the Trump White House. Look, a lot of Canadians we know just don't like Donald Trump. His own personal style and his brand of politics does not align with them. And probably people rated tariffs much higher on their list of concern because of that factor. They saw him as the author of this thing that was being inflicted upon Canadian businesses and Canadian industries. But as we proceed, this is now, I say, months and months of talks. What has been over 6 months since the inauguration, pretty much the same like the time since those first so-called fentanyl tariffs were put in place. Canadians, according to Leger, are now kind of becoming accustomed to it. They see the fact that a great deal of Canadian exports are unaffected by this because of the USMCA agreement and the Trump administration's decision to exempt those products from the fentanyl tariffs. The other thing is there is the potential out here for the government in that we've seen a court ruling this week from the United States basically saying Trump broke the law, that his tariffs, some of his tariffs that he's imposed on other countries, including those fentanyl tariffs originally imposed on Canada and on Mexico, are not legal. He should have gone to Congress to get those through. So again, possibly a reason why Canadians are less worried about those tariffs and they're more concerned now about their own personal finances, how much they're paying at the grocery store, how much they're paying to rent an apartment.
And not to leave out the opposition in all of this, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has been hitting the microphones a little bit since this cabinet retreat began, but also since he won his by-election. So with the shifting mood of Canadians on what they have as their top priorities, and Pierre Poilievre coming back again, trying to hammer the government on some of these more kitchen table issues. How do you see that political risk playing out as we expect the showdown between Carney and Poilievre when Parliament returns on September 15th?
Yeah, it's funny. The other day I was grabbing a flight from Ottawa down here to Toronto so I could attend this cabinet planning forum, and who was on the flight? None other than Pierre Poilievre. I had a moment to chat with him, and I didn't know he was coming. Didn't think he was coming to the cabinet retreat, that's for sure. But he said, "Yeah, I've got some events planned in Toronto." And yeah, he's had 2 events now here in the GTA over the 2 days that the Carney cabinet is meeting. And of course, I mean, the idea here is you want to steal a little bit of the media spotlight that's shining on the cabinet meeting and try and use that to get your message out. And this afternoon, an event in Mississauga where Poilievre was talking about the failure of the Carney government to make any progress in the time that he has been prime minister. Keep in mind, the election was end of April, but Carney actually became prime minister in the previous month back in March. So he's had we're coming up on 5 months now that he has had time to act on some of these things. The concern that Poilievre is expressing is that nothing seems to be happening, despite all the commitments and the pledges that Carney made during the election campaign. He still hasn't made any headway in solving the trade dispute. He's also saying, listen, Carney talking about opening an office, the major projects office, which the government announced last week is going to open in Calgary. They've named somebody who had worked on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, an executive, to head up that office. That's the group of bureaucrats that is going to supposedly fast track the approval of these projects. But as Poilievre pointing out, that's great. Set up an office that maybe is going to approve some of these projects, maybe in the future, if there is a private sector proponent who is going to put up the money to build a pipeline, build a new port, build a new electricity systems and interties. You need someone to come forward and actually offer up the money, but none of that has happened yet. And, Poilievre, he's trying to make political capital here out of this. He's trying to make some hay. Is he being realistic? Is it actually possible that Carney could have this soon moved to get these projects underway? Well, they're big multi-billion-dollar projects that they are being contemplated. These things do not happen overnight. We have been working on timelines that have been a decade or longer in the past. This government planning to accelerate it dramatically, but Poilievre saying, well, show me the money. Why has it not happened? We don't have any of these projects underway. We're still dealing with these Trump tariffs. Nothing, in the view of Pierre Poilievre, has markedly changed since since Carney became prime minister, and he also accuses Carney of planning a budget that is going to double the size of the federal deficit. Not exactly sure where he's getting those numbers because, of course, nobody's seen the federal government. We don't know exactly what the deficit is going to be for this year or for years in the future. But until he produces that, Pierre Poilievre is going to be all too happy to capitalize on it politically.
All right. It should be a fiery fall sitting of Parliament when the MPs return to the House of Commons. Glen, thanks so much for this. Really appreciate your thoughts.
My pleasure, Cormac.
That was CityNews federal political reporter Glen McGregor speaking with me about the strategy session the Prime Minister held with his cabinet in Toronto ahead of the return of Parliament. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.